Hello, this is group number 5, which is integrated by Samantha Kim and Andrea Martinez. We will going to focus our project on the systemic lupus erythematosus autoimmune disease, which is best known as a lupus or SLE. This is a very unpredictable and misunderstood autoimmune disease, very difficult to diagnose, hard to live with, and a challenge to treat for the doctors. Lupus has a range of symptoms that strikes without any warning to the patients who suffer from it. In the US, there is a population around 1.5 million of people who suffer from lupus without any cure. There is no cure at the moment. However, the good news is that with the support of the doctors and family, it's very easy to manage and live with it. It can be mild for some people, it can be life threatening for some others, but still a mystery, and that's why we would like to focus our project on this disease. Hope you enjoyed, and we will continue with some further definitions that will explain a little bit more about what it is, the SLE disease. Now, to discuss further the definition of the lupus and other main points of this disease, first it is important to know what it is an autoimmune disease. An autoimmune disease is simply a malfunction of the immune system when the cells, tissues, and organs they attack themselves, creating symptoms that affects our life. There are more than 80 known autoimmune diseases, which only in the US around 24 million of people suffer from it, at least one of them. So now we will discuss further now that the definition of the lupus. Now that we know the definition of an autoimmune disease, it is important to discuss what it is the systemic lupus erythematosus disease. As mentioned, it is an autoimmune disease which causes systemic inflammation that affects multiple organs on our bodies. According to guitarists, it's due to the inappropriate response of self-antigens by the immune system, which break in immunological tolerance and as you can see on the image, it attacks the pleural function. It can cause heart problems, lupus nephritis, arthritis, and many other symptoms that it can be life-threatening for some people. In most cases, affects the skin and kidneys mainly, but other organs can be affected too. The lupus, when active, can lead to devastating effects on the body, and it's really important to know that some symptoms of the systemic lupus erythematosus disease may vary widely with the individual. For some other, it's mild, for some other, it can be very dangerous disease. Lupus remains a mystery for many people around the world, even for the scientific community, which still they don't know what is the main reason that caused this disease on our bodies. They still don't know if it's genetic, if it's some kind of environment, if it's a stress that might trigger the symptoms of lupus in our bodies. And that's why it is very important to follow the news and educate ourselves about these kind of diseases. For example, we have the Today Journal who says that some rash it can be a sign of lupus, so that's why we have to pay attention to it. He says that here what experts would like you to know about the chronic conditions some other people have. This type of news help others to educate themselves about lupus, see how serious is this kind of disease, and trying to help others who are diagnosed with it. The more support other people with this disease have, the better for them to live with. It can lower the stress level and mild the symptoms a little bit better. So that's why some foundations and researchers use journalists and news to educate other people about this kind of diseases. Moreover, we have the impact on this disease on the economy. As you can see, the U.S. healthcare system spends around $13 billion annually trying to educate, do research, and find better treatments for people who suffer from lupus. That's why it's so important, and it remains a challenge for the scientific community. Um, the really the origin of the disease and what really caused it, to trying to find a cure for it and lower the annually burden of the spending for this kind of treatments. The cost of the treatment varies according to the symptoms or the flares that one person with lupus can have. If the flares are very constant and painful, the more treatment this person is gonna need, of course. That's why the average cost of the treatment for any person with lupus, it can be up to $50,000 annually. So, looking at this, we can might say that lupus causes a very serious effect on the economy, not only on the people who suffer from it, but also on the healthcare system. That's why foundation like Lupus Foundation of America works on the research of better treatments to try to lower all this burden of money who goes to the treatment and education and diagnosing of the people with lupus. Moreover, we following our previous point, it is important to know the government policies to treat SLE disease. These policies, as you can see, the percentage of the big funding of the federal government to treat the SLE goes to the CDC to identify who has lupus and investigate how to decrease the time needed to make the diagnosis. The other biggest part of the federal funding goes to the research because we know if with a better understanding of the disease, it can lead to a better treatment and lower the impact of the economy, not only for the government but most important for the people who suffer from lupus. If we can lower the impact on the economy of this disease, we will not only creating a better treatment for the people, but also lowering the stress or trying to find the money to pay their bills to find their treatment. The other part of this government funding it goes to the education and awareness, especially for the minorities who might not know where to go to the doctor and check if they have lupus or not, or they might not know the symptoms. So the government is spending this amount of money to try to educate other people about this disease. All this federal funding represent and bring an effective support to the population with SLE. And not only that, it generates um, policy change. We can see all these policies on the Lupus Foundation in America website. They have all the information that someone who might be interested on knowing more about lupus, they can go there and see all the government successes, future goals to treat this disease. On the other hand, now that we understand the definition of lupus and the impact of the economy, not only on the government side, also on the patient side, it is important to know the serious effects of the environment that the people live or work affects those who has lupus or might trigger the development of the disease on some others that they might not have it. For example, in stress, if someone who has been diagnosed with lupus is currently under a stress situation, it will probably trigger flares and symptoms can be worsened for this person because as the rheumatology section at the Rush University Medical Center in Chicago says that there are many studies that connect stress with immune reaction. Therefore, they definitely know that stress can bring flares of lupus to those who suffer from it. They also said that the toxic exposure, like the exposure to silica, right, which is a mineral that people can be exposed to in mining and glass production, long term of this exposure can trigger the development of the SLE disease. Now, the scientific community is studying also the long-term exposure of pesticides and insecticides, who they are still not sure, but they are trying to figure out if these pesticides and insecticides can also trigger symptoms as silica does. On the other side, we have the virus. Patients who suffer from lupus, since their autoimmune system doesn't work properly, right? The exposure to virus like the virus who cause mononucleosis might not behave, or the person might not be able to create antibodies to fight the kind of viruses because their autoimmune system does not work right. So they will not create antibodies for certain virus, and therefore they might need more treatment and support from doctors and other people. Also, a recent research says that the climate change might also bring flares or worsen the symptoms of those who already suffer from lupus. For example, we have this investigation from 2019 from George Stohan, who is a rheumatologist, who says that ultimately our results are confirmed that in future studies it is inevitable that rising temperatures and weather extremes expected as a result of climate change will have an effect on those who suffer from lupus. Therefore, it is very important for the scientific community to keep researching on the environment of people, on the environment, virus, and everything, and studying people who already suffer from lupus to see which is the bigger trigger or risk factor that might cause the development of this disease. Continuing with our previous point, now that we know how serious it is the environment for someone who already suffered from lupus or to other people whose certain environments might trigger the development of the disease, it is important to study the health impact and predisposition factors, right? So on the government side, they are trying to increase their awareness of SLE on those communities where African American people it's dominant. Why? Because most of the people on this rate they belong to the bigger part of the population who suffer from lupus. So the government trying to funding projects to integrate the educations of lupus and other autoimmune diseases in school through programs that will raise awareness of the signs of development of autoimmune diseases. This will take us to the health impact. On the health impact side, doctors and nurses who might be treating someone with lupus, they have to monitor the antibody count. They have to check if the symptoms are getting worse or they are getting better, and they have to ensure that a patient is prescribed with hydroxychloroquine, and therefore they have to encourage the patient to follow the treatment and continue their use there to lower the impact of the disease symptoms on these patients, and therefore they might live a normal life without triggering the threatening their lives. So, on the environment impact, now we know that there are some environments that might trigger the development of the disease, or get they might worsen the symptoms of some people. Therefore, this the doctor, the nurse, or somebody who are supporting the patient, they have to ensure that they can follow the treatment and they are living in an environment who might not trigger or worse the symptoms of these patients. Now that we know how serious is the environment, the economic impact of lupus in the US, I'll let you follow with.
Lupus is a chronic disease that affects various organ systems due to the formation and deposition of autoantibodies and immune complexes. The formation of autoantibodies and immune complexes cause inflammatory reactions, which then causes the tissue inflammation and damage associated with SLE that will lead to eventual organ damage. With T-cell antigen stimulation, B cells become hyperactive and increase production of antibodies for antigens found on the surface of apoptotic cells. These antigens are causing T cell and B cell stimulation that can be attributed to the inappropriate removal of apoptotic cells. Unlike in healthy individuals, autoantigen specific T cells and B cells can interact to produce harmful autoantibodies. Autoantibodies identified in SLE are anti-nuclear antibodies that target the components of the nucleus. Specifically, double-stranded DNA antibodies or anti-nuclear antibodies are specific for lupus. Systemic lupus erythematosus affects the cellular level beginning with apoptotic cells. When these cells die, cellular material forms on the surface. In healthy individuals, phagocytic cells are able to remove the cellular material. However, lupus patients have impaired phagocytic cells, which leads to suboptimal disposal of the dying cell material. Patients with lupus have an inappropriate response to self-antigens. The immune response in lupus patients is unable to control the autoreactive T, B, and antigen-presenting cells. With these active immune cells, cytokines, antibodies, oxidants, and hydrolytic enzymes are released. The release of these components leads to cellular infiltration of various organs. The figure on the top right shows the different immune responses from all the different cells, including the cytokines, the macrophages, and the interleukins. And the figure on the bottom shows how the aberrant T and B cell configuration occur in SLE. The T cells display an aberrant phenotype upon activation as they express CD40 ligand that helps B cells produce autoantibodies and then help the T cells not to undergo apoptosis. Interleukin 17 positive T cells infiltrate tissues and cause organ formation. Autoreactive B cells escape, then produce the autoantibodies. Such as the kidneys. The clinical manifestation of prevention for systemic lupus erythematosus is based on identifying incomplete lupus erythematosus, also known as ILE, in order to avoid, delay, or improve the disease process of SLE. The first step is usually to test patients for autoantibodies associated with SLE, such as anti-nuclear antibodies and anti-double-stranded DNA antibodies. It is also important to be able to recognize predictors and clinical manifestations such as oral ulcers, proteinuria, and anti-double-stranded DNA. It is also important to focus on increasing disease awareness targeted at ethnic minorities who have higher incidence of SLE, such as African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans. It is also important to recognize the biomarkers associated with SLE that can appear years before diagnosis, such as genetic factors, infections, ANAs, and anti-dsDNA, and also ribonucleic proteins. On the right, you'll see the clinical pathway in order to prevent further progress of the disease. And it starts with recognizing that there are positive anti-nuclear antibodies and also seeing if there are signs and symptoms of ILE. So then it is important to establish the risk of SLE development by taking into account the demographic and clinical setting, the biomarkers involved, and the genetic and environmental factors that the patient might be surrounded by. And then once those risk factors are determined, it is important to modify those by stopping any smoking, also protecting against UV rays, and in the case that there's low vitamin D, to increase the amount of vitamin D within the body. And once that they pass that step, it is then necessary to go to pharmacological intervention, which includes antimalarial therapy, usually with the medication hydroxychloroquine. And finally, it is important to monitor for disease progression. So it's important to continue with follow-ups with patients that are high risk. And on the graph on the bottom, it shows how the onset of autoimmunity is dependent on genes and environment triggers. And then as the disease progresses, it becomes an autoimmunity accelerator, such as hormones, infections, and toxins. That's where you'll see the presence of anti-nuclear antibodies. And then continuing, it will be shown to present anti-double-stranded DNA. Once you arrive to ILE, also known as incomplete lupus, then you'll see the clinical onset, which will be oral ulcers, arthritis, proteinuria, urine cellular cast, and malar rash, which will give finally to the rise of complete lupus. While some cases of systemic lupus erythematosus are due to genetic predisposition, other cases can actually be caused by environmental triggers. Prevention as an individual to these triggers would include avoiding bacterial and viral infections, reducing or limiting sun exposure, wearing sunscreen to limit the exposure to UV rays, getting enough sleep, for example, around 7 to 8 hours, and following the proper directions on all prescription medications. The two leading testing tools for lupus are the SLE-Key roulette test and the biomarker blood test. The SLE-Key roulette test is based on quantitative proteomics. It uses a chip microarray that is coded with around 200 autoantigens associated with SLE pathways. Serum samples are tested on the intensity of binding. As seen on the graph on the right, the SLE-Key roulette test effectively separated the healthy neutrals and the SLE patients despite having different diagnosis times. The other testing tool is a biomarker blood test that is able to measure SLE disease activity while also having a predictive feature. It has the potential to measure the outcome for lupus patients. The United States government granted Progentic Diagnostics a federal grant in order to ensure accuracy and predictive features for biomarker blood tests in effort to diagnose lupus. Lupus has significant health disparities within different communities. Areas to be tested should take into consideration the socioeconomic factors present. It's important to note that minorities have higher incidence of systemic lupus erythematosus, such as African Americans, Asians, and Hispanics. So areas to be tested include communities that are socially disadvantaged, impoverished, lowly educated, and composed of minorities. Here's a bibliography. Thank you very much.